Gun trucks were never part of the plan. They weren't issued, they weren't standard, and they definitely weren't designed in some office. But when convoys kept getting ambushed in Vietnam with almost no protection, soldiers started building their own defense, right there in the field. One of the turning points came after a particularly bad ambush in 1967. We'll get to that story in a moment. First, it's important to understand how things got to that point. By the late 1960s, US forces in Vietnam were stretched across remote bases, and the only way to keep them supplied was by road. Thousands of gallons of fuel, crates of ammunition, spare parts, food, water, everything had to move in long convoys of trucks through terrain that was perfect for an ambush. The roads were narrow, often unpaved, twisting through mountains and dense jungle. Names like Devil's Hairpin and Death Valley weren't exaggerations. There were blind curves every few hundred meters, thick foliage right up to the roadside, and dozens of spots where a small enemy team could hit and disappear without a trace. Convoys didn't have much in the way of protection. A few jeeps with mounted M60 machine guns might ride with them, but there weren't enough armored vehicles to go around. Tanks and APCs were needed elsewhere, closer to the front lines, so supply trucks were mostly left on their own. And these weren't combat troops. Most of the people in those convoys were drivers. Their job was to deliver fuel or gear, not fight off coordinated attacks. But in Vietnam, there was no front line and no safe zone. That meant every supply run came with real risk. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong understood that better than anyone. They learned how to exploit weak points in convoy routes, waited and picked their moments carefully. Mines, recoilless rifles, automatic fire, it only took a few minutes to wreck an entire convoy and disappear. Eventually, something had to change. In September 1967, one ambush made it clear that drivers couldn't rely on backup, so they started creating their own. On the afternoon of September 2nd, 1967, a 39-vehicle convoy from the 8th Transportation Group left Pleiku, heading back to the coastal city of Quy Nhon. They'd just finished delivering supplies to the 1st Cavalry Division earlier that day. The route back was supposed to be routine, but a 5,000-gallon fuel tanker at the rear of the convoy was having trouble keeping up, which created a gap about 500 meters wide between the front and rear sections. That made the whole convoy vulnerable. There were only 2 jeeps with M60s assigned for escort, and with the columns split like that, they couldn't cover both ends. The convoy commander knew this was a problem, and just as he was thinking this was not a good situation, a 57mm rocket slammed into the lead jeep. That was the start of the ambush. Almost instantly, enemy fire came from the tree line along the road. AKs, RPGs, mines, recoilless rifles. About 29 trucks were caught in a 700-meter-long kill zone. With no cover and limited weapons, the convoy was completely exposed. One of the biggest dangers was the fuel tanker at the rear. It was directly hit and caught fire. Somehow, it didn't explode, but that was just luck. Disabled vehicles started piling up fast. Some were taken out by recoilless rifles, others by mines that had been buried ahead of time and triggered remotely. The soldiers in the convoy tried to return fire, but they were outgunned and spread thin. Most had little more than personal weapons, and whatever firepower the escort jeeps could offer. A company from the 1st Cavalry Division, stationed less than a mile away, mobilized quickly. They got to the site about 15 minutes after the ambush started, but by then, the enemy had already disappeared into the jungle. The aftermath was brutal. 9 US soldiers killed, 17 wounded, and nearly 30 vehicles destroyed or left behind. There was no mistaking what this meant. The enemy had figured out how to hit convoys hard, fast, and without getting caught. And unless something changed, it was going to keep happening. From that point on, supply crews started doing what the army hadn't, arming and protecting their trucks themselves. After the Pleiku ambush, no one in the transport units expected help to arrive in time, so they stopped waiting for it. The first step was figuring out how to add some protection. Most of the cargo trucks were 2.5-ton M35s, basic haulers with no armor. Crews started by lining the truck beds with sandbags and sheets of plywood. It was better than nothing, but not by much. The sandbags got soaked in the rain, turned into dead weight, and overloaded the suspension. Trucks became harder to steer, slower to brake, and sometimes the extra weight even snapped axles. The next idea was welding on steel plates, actual armor. Problem was, steel wasn't easy to come by, so crews got creative. If another unit had spare material lying around, it might go missing overnight. Sometimes it wasn't even spare, it was just taken. No one really asked questions. If it meant surviving the next convoy run, that was enough. They started building what became known as the gun box. 4 steel walls welded around the cargo bed, high enough to give cover to the gunners inside. Some designs added a second layer of steel with a gap between them, which helped reduce damage from explosives and armor-piercing rounds. The engine bay, fuel tank, and cab floor were also reinforced, giving the driver at least some protection against mines. Eventually, the heavier M54 5-ton trucks became the preferred platform. They could handle more weight and more firepower without falling apart. The 51 dump trucks were also used. And then someone had an idea that looked ridiculous but actually worked. They mounted the armoured hull of a damaged M113 APC onto the back of a truck. They stripped out the engine and tracks, just kept the armoured shell and bolted it down. It gave the crew better protection and a solid platform for mounting weapons, but it wasn't perfect. The added weight made the truck top-heavy, and it handled poorly, especially on rough terrain or sharp turns. Still, in a firefight, the trade-off was worth it. As for the weapons, those kept evolving too. It started with M60s, 1 or 2 on a pivoting mount, enough to return fire, but soon crews were adding 50 caliber machine guns. Some trucks had 2 or 3 of them. Others went even further, installing the M45 Maxon mount, originally used for anti-aircraft defense. It held 450 cals and could fire around 2,000 rounds per minute. When that thing opened up during an ambush, it shut everything down in front of it. Some crews mounted M134 miniguns. One famous truck called Pure Hell had a hand-cranked version, no electric motor like old Gatling gun from the 1800s. It looked strange, but it worked. The trucks carried huge amounts of ammunition, thousands of rounds for each weapon. They also had grenade launchers, light anti-tank weapons, and stacks of hand grenades. On top of that, many crews brought older weapons they trusted more than the standard-issue rifles. World War II-era BARs, Thompson's M1 Grands, even captured AK-47s. Crews gave their trucks unique and creative names like the Untouchable, Brutus, the Misfits, Eve of Destruction. These were built by hand, and the crews trusted them with their lives. If you want to hear more stories like this or see a full video where we go deep into the story of gun trucks, feel free to subscribe. There's more coming soon.